Hello again and welcome to the introduction section of our module Management of International Renewable Energy Projects. Let us start with a very simple question. What is a project? Well, a project can be defined as a series of activities which are designed to produce unique products or services, also called the project outputs, and which are produced within a defined time period, which are time bound, and produced as well according to a defined budget. These products or services, also called outputs of the project, are undertaken to meet unique objectives and goals set up at the beginning of the project. Typical results that will bring about the beneficial change which is searched for with the project. Like I have told you in the presentation of the module, the project cycle management that we will follow has 5 phases. The first phase is normally called the identification phase. Then we have the analysis, where in this module we adopt the theory of change approach, which is a more comprehensive, holistic approach to understand the actual situation in the project region where we are working, produce a situation analysis of the needs for research and development in that area, to understand the stakeholders and their problems, and to try and find a concept for the solutions. The project will then will then analyze which outputs would then be necessary for achieving the necessary outcomes, and also the activities needed to produce these outputs. At the end, we will produce a theory of change narrative that explains basically how the interventions proposed by your project, meaning the outputs that you are producing, how will they unfold into positive results, into positive outcomes. From there on, we will then move to the design phase of the project cycle management, where we translate this theory of change to a log frame matrix that is composed of indicators as well according to each result that we then need for setting up a monitoring and evaluation plan. So basically what I have explained to you in the introductory session recorded previously. Having done this, your monitoring and evaluation plan, having the activity and financial budgets, so you have then a complete project proposal. So identification, analysis, and design of the project proposal are the 3 main phases of the project cycle management that we are going to address in this module. After you have done this, then you submit your project proposal to the agency where you are working, or you submit the proposal to some donor for requiring for funding and for working on the region that you are targeting. If the proposal is positively evaluated, then you are in the position of starting the implementation of the project, which is the 4th phase of the project cycle management. And you will implement all the activities following the logical framework matrix structure that you have, and also having your activity schedule so that you can plan which resources, which manpower is going to be active in which period. After the project is closed, you have achieved your results, so it's time for evaluating what has been achieved. And this is done in the evaluation phase, which is normally taken care of by the donors to which you have submitted your proposal. So this is very much in a nutshell again what the project management cycle is all about. Just wanted to draw your attention a little bit more to the analysis phase, which is where we're going to work the most time. The process of planning the activities and outputs of the project is done in the analysis phase of the project. It's basically a top-down analysis that we do, starting with the overarching problem that we identify there, the problems that are contributing to this overarching problem, and the solutions then needed to overcome all these problems. The outcomes that the project proposes to achieve. Only after we know which outcomes are we aiming at, are we able to identify the appropriate outputs and the activities needed. Now, who uses project management? Well, project management is very much used, especially for international development, of course, is very much used for development cooperation agencies and at different organizational levels. Talking about development cooperation agencies like the United Nations Development Program, UNDP, like the USAID, like the Consultative Group for International Agricultural Research, like the CGRs, which include the International Water Research Institute inside, or the International Rice Research Institute, but also others like the International Union for Conservation of Nature, IUCN, or the German Gesellschaft für internationale Zusammenarbeit, the GIZ, the World Bank, and so on and so on. So there are numerous agencies, some NGOs, some governmental like the GIZ, that work in international development and use project management for developing their interventions. These development and cooperation agencies, they are characterized by different organizational or management levels, let's say. Typically, they have a first level that has been established the longest and for which there is most experience. This is the project level that you can see here at the bottom. The second level at which these agencies work is the country level program, with performance measurement and management systems within their country offices or operating units. So any of these agencies, they have country offices spread all over the world. The third level is then what is called the corporate or agency-wide level, where the results from their interventions in different regions of different countries around the world are managed and especially in line with the United Nations Sustainability Development Goals. So the performance measurement of a development agency at the agency-wide level is always made against the SDGs. So it is to expect then that the work of these development agencies that basically use project management is framed in the Agenda 2030 and in the SDGs. So Agenda 2030 is basically a global project, a humanity project. It's a plan of action for people, for the planet and for prosperity. The Agenda 2030, the main goal of this agenda is in fact the eradication of poverty in all its forms and dimensions, including extreme poverty, of course. The SDGs are in fact organized as an overarching, as a global project management structure, according to which development agencies or development departments of countries organize their work when it regards issues of sustainable development. So the SDGs came to replace the Millennium Development Goals, the so-called MDGs, which, if you recall, ended in 2015. SDGs are detached from an international legal binding system, but they nevertheless set the frame in which development projects should operate, just like I said before. So the achievement of the SDGs depends very much on the aggregated results from so many development projects running all over the world, which most of them are then being implemented by this type of development agencies. New in this SDG framework is for sure the role of development partner countries. This has been reinforced in international cooperation for development, meaning that, unlike the MDGs, the SDG framework does not distinguish now between developed or developing nations. The goals they apply to all countries. So there's a bigger weight given to the role of stakeholders in the project design and implementation. Let us now talk a little bit on the history of development cooperation and project management. Project management, as we now know it, is the result of kind of a methodological evolution. We start by considering the 90s. In this decade, the work of development agencies and, of course, for those that were not NGOs, the governments behind them, was under considerable pressure. The public sector of the OECD countries at that time stand very much under pressure regarding the development and cooperation activities. So the public's perception that aid programs are failing to produce significant development results was a big concern at that time. There was a lack of public confidence in governments, and better accountability for achieving results with taxpayers' monies was an issue everywhere, and public was demanding for more careful handling of public money. So there were many issues regarding the deficits of these countries in that time, about structural problems, about growing competitiveness and globalization issues. So there was a growing demand for better and more responsive services, such as those of development and cooperation. So there was a trend to a declining aid budget at that time. So results regarding the investments done by public agencies on development, they were not really tangible. People were not seeing enough reductions in poverty. People were not seeing enough increases in poor people's incomes in developing countries. And so there was kind of a problem on how to accept that so much public funding would be applied in such activities, since the public could not see the result. Historically, government departments and implementing organizations or implementing agencies had a wrong approach on how to induce development. They basically focused their attention on the inputs, what they spent, on the activities, what they did, and on their outputs, what they produced. So they were only focusing their attention to what they were accountable for in the short term. While information about inputs, the activities, and the outputs is of course important, it did not tell implementers or the development agencies whether or not they were making progress in addressing the development issues they had identified at the beginning. Issues like food security or water security, issues from energy security, at the end, issues of poverty reduction. So these issues were not being addressed in an effective way. Agencies, they kind of lost the sight of the results of their programs, the results that they were aiming at the beginning. So there was no long-term effectiveness of the programming, and this was being reflected in very poor results, in very poor long-term results, and the public sector could not afford to be investing in such initiatives that were not bringing about the desired results. There was then a pertinent need for new approaches of project management to raise the standards of performance and define success in terms of actual development results that should be achieved. New project management approaches were then developed in that time, the most prominent ones being the results-based management and the logical framework approach. These approaches, they looked beyond the activities and outputs to focus on actual development results, the outcomes that should be achieved, the development changes to which the project was supposed to be contributing to. So the focus were now much more on the long term and not that much on the operative part of the project management. With the introduction of the results-based management, the way in which one should look at the project was inverted. According to the RBM, one should start with a top-down analysis, first having a clear picture of the results that we want to see achieved in the long term. These are called the impacts or the goals of a project. Only after we should concentrate on the outcomes, which are basically the preconditions that should be achieved so that the goal of the project can be realized. And only after the project is then concerned with what products and services, what outputs should we produce to achieve these outcomes, which ultimately will contribute to the achievement of the goal. So this is the results framework that was a milestone in the 90s as a response to the very weak results that the policies of development was having at that time. Only after the results are clear should then a project be concerned with which activities should be planned and which inputs are we going to need for implementing these activities and ultimately producing our products, our outputs. So first was the planning, and only afterwards was the implementation. First were the results, only afterwards we should turn our attention planning the resources needed. The goal of the project usually represents, let's say, the reason of existence of an organization, a policy or a program of the project, and it takes the form of a sustainable change of state among the beneficiaries of this project, a long-term beneficial change for the target populations that the project is aiming at. These are not results that can be achieved by the project in the short run. The projects can only contribute to the achievement of the goals. Other stakeholders would mostly also play a role in achieving the development goals. Example of goals could be enhancing the economic prosperity of the poor, particularly women and youth in some country and some region. Could be a goal written as increased food security of food insecure populations in region Y of country X. Could be as well formulated as improved equitable health of girls and boys under age 5 in rural areas of the region X in country Y. So as you see, these are not results that can be achieved in the short run. These are only results to which the project, through your project interventions, can contribute in the long run. We can have different types of outcomes depending if they have a more medium-term nature or if they have a more short-term nature. Examples of intermediate outcomes could be, for example, the increased productivity of rice farmers, let's say, in a river basin in central Vietnam. So these would be then the end users, the beneficiaries of this intermediate outcome will be directly the end users, the farmers themselves. Immediate outcomes, like I said, have a more short-term nature. They are more regarded to change in capacities, like the increase in knowledge or awareness or skills, abilities, access to something, to capital, for instance, among the next users and end users. An example would be the increased knowledge of soil and water conservation measures in the plains of some region X. So this is a precondition for an intermediate outcome like the increase in productivity, for instance. So another immediate outcome could be the improved access to equipment and infrastructure by extension officers in some region X. So this will allow then the extension officers to be in the position of training the farmers. So this would be an intermediate outcome of this would be that the farmers are now better trained in some methods of soil and water conservation, for example, because the immediate outcome of the project was to facilitate the access of these extension officers, the next users that on their turn were then in the position of training the farmers in a much more appropriate way. Outputs are the direct products or services that are produced by the project that need the activities of the development agency. So this could be demonstration sessions and capacity development courses delivered on, let's say, the identification and management of crop diseases. Could be the implementation of suitable equipment for milk collection and conservation from smallholders in some peri-urban region of some country. Outputs are, in fact, what one could name as the project intervention. They are what the project is in fact producing, what the project is in fact delivering. Activities are then in fact actions taken by the project participants, by the teams of the project, through which inputs are mobilized to produce these outputs that we have spoken about. So imagine that we have an output which is called demonstration sessions and capacity development courses delivered for soil and water conservation technologies, meaning that the project is doing capacity building and they want to produce courses, guidelines for soil and water conservation technologies. So what would be the activities needed to produce this output? Typical activities for this would be, for example, to conduct workshops with stakeholders where you make an assessment of the needs regarding capacity development, including consultation with male and female staff, paying attention to gender issues. We'll be designing gender-sensitive training materials on soil and water conservation guidelines. So two types of activities that will then ultimately produce the output which would be the guidelines for soil and water conservation technologies in a certain region, in a certain country. The inputs are, of course, the resources that you need to produce, to develop such activities for producing the outputs, are the financial, the human, the material, the information resources that are used then in these activities that are needed to produce these outputs in order to accomplish the outcomes, in order to accomplish the goal of the project. So inputs are the lowest level at the project planning. Now, summarizing once more the results chain. This is called the sequence of results, is called the results chain. We have started from the planning phase, we've started to look at the impacts, the goals that we want to achieve. We have looked at the outcomes that we need to have to achieve these goals, the preconditions necessary to achieve these goals. And then we saw which outputs are necessary, which interventions of the project should be in place so that we can achieve these results, these outcomes, and then we plan the inputs and the activities that are necessary to produce these outputs. So that from the planning perspective is a top-down perspective. From the operating perspective, the execution of the project is a bottom-up one. So when we start to implement the project, then we have to look at the activities and the inputs necessary for implementing those, and then at the outputs that are going to be produced by our project. Regarding the outcomes necessary, or the outcomes that are going to be achieved, there are basically two types of outcomes. Some outcomes are more directed to the change in capacities or the access to resources and equipment, means of achieving some results, of some benefits. The others are more directed to behavioral practices, acceptance of technologies, performances, increasing productivity, increasing water efficiency, water use efficiency, etc. So these are basically the two blocks of outcomes that mostly appear in the projects regarding development in the Global South.